The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the leafless trees outside the precinct window. The temperature had dropped significantly overnight, and the streets of Brooklyn were now coated in a thin sheet of ice. I took a deep breath, adjusting my reading glasses as I reviewed the stack of paperwork from a recent burglary case. My name is Michael Spencer, a 49-year-old detective with the New York Police Department. In just a few months, I'd be turning 50, a milestone I never thought I'd reach without solving the biggest mystery of my life: the disappearance of my father. It had been 41 years since that day. I was just 8 years old when he walked out the door, promising to be back soon. But he never returned, and I never found out why. I had long since stopped actively searching. Life moves on, and as much as I hated to admit it, so did I. Cases, promotions, friendships, they all filled the empty spaces. But that unanswered question, that aching absence, had always been there, lurking. I was lost in thought when my partner, Eric Johnson, burst into the office, his face tense with urgency. "Mike, we got a situation," he said, slightly out of breath. "A homeless guy was found collapsed in an alley near Fulton Street. Looks bad. Paramedics are on the way, but they need us there." Normally, I would have assigned this to one of the younger officers. But today, something was off. A heavy weight settled in my chest, an unshakable sense of unease. It was irrational, but it was there, pressing against my ribs like a hand pushing me forward. I grabbed my coat and keys.
"All right,
let's go." The streets were quieter than expected for a weekday morning. It took us just under 15 minutes to reach Fulton Street, where the flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance reflected off the wet pavement. The alley itself was narrow and grimy, wedged between two aging brick buildings. The air smelled of damp cardboard and old cigarettes. A few stray cats darted between piles of discarded newspapers as paramedics worked over a figure slumped against a graffitied dumpster. I stepped closer, my boots crunching over broken glass. The man was wrapped in a tattered, mud-stained blanket, his face barely visible beneath the tangled mess of gray-streaked beard and unkempt hair. His body was unnaturally thin, skin stretched over sharp bones, and his hands were raw from the cold. The paramedic, a young woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, glanced up as I approached. "Severe malnutrition and hypothermia," she reported. "His vitals are weak, but he's alive." Barely. I crouched beside him, trying to get a better look. His breathing was shallow, his lips cracked and pale. There was something eerily familiar about him. I shook off the feeling. I'd seen countless homeless men in my years on the force. They all started to look the same after a while. "Any ID?" I asked. The paramedic shook her head. "Nothing on him. Let's run a fingerprint scan." I pulled out my portable scanner, a small device we use to check for criminal records and missing persons reports. Standard protocol. As I reached for his hand, something made me stop. His right pinky finger was missing. The stub was old, long since healed, as if it had been missing for decades. My chest tightened.
No, it couldn't be.
I pressed his remaining fingers against the scanner. 30 seconds later, a name popped up on the screen. Richard Spencer. My breath hitched. My father's name. My mind reeled. The last time I had seen that name, I was a child, sitting on a cold wooden church pew, my small hands clenched in my lap. I could still hear my mother's voice telling me, "Daddy will be back soon, sweetheart." But he never was. For years, I had wondered if he had died. If something terrible had happened to him. If he had abandoned us on purpose. But now he was here, lying in a filthy alley. A homeless man, barely clinging to life. I swallowed hard, willing the lump in my throat to disappear. There had to be some mistake. That's just a common name, right?" I muttered, shaking my head. It could be anyone. Eric, standing behind me, was unusually quiet. Mike. He hesitated. Didn't you tell me once that you're dad? I cut him off. It's not him. I couldn't explain why, but I desperately needed that to be true. Because if it was him, how the hell was I supposed to face him? The paramedics loaded the man into the ambulance, and before I could think twice, I climbed in with them. Eric shot me a look. You sure about this? I need to see this through, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. The ride to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital was silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The whole time, I kept staring at his hand, the one missing a finger. A memory resurfaced. I was 5 years old, sitting on the kitchen counter, watching Dad wrap his injured hand in a dish towel. What happened, Daddy? I had asked. Got caught in a machine at work, buddy, he had said with a chuckle, ruffling my hair. Just a little accident. I remembered being fascinated by the way his hand looked, how different it was from everyone else's. And now, here it was again. That same missing finger. My stomach turned. By the time we arrived at the hospital, the weight in my chest had only grown heavier. As doctors examined him, I paced the hallway, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. My thoughts were racing. Then my phone buzzed. It was Eric. Mike. His voice was low, careful. Are you sitting down? What? They ran the scan again through an old missing persons database, he continued. There's no doubt. This guy, he's your father. My whole body went cold. I turned, looking toward the hospital room where the man I had spent my entire life wondering about lay unconscious. For the first time in 41 years, I was just a few feet away from my father. But instead of relief, all I felt was fear. I stood outside the hospital room, staring through the narrow window in the door. The man, my father, lay motionless on the hospital bed. 4 lines ran into his arm. A heart monitor beeped steadily beside him. His breathing was uneven, his frail chest rising and falling beneath the thin hospital gown. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows over his hollowed cheeks, deep-set eyes, and scruffy gray beard. He looked nothing like the man I had once known. Or maybe I had simply forgotten. 41 years was a long time. The last memory I had of him was from that winter night when he had kissed my forehead, ruffled my hair, and said, "Be good, Mikey. I'll be back before you know it." I had believed him. I had sat by the window for hours, waiting for a father who never returned. And now here he was, a homeless man, found collapsed in a filthy alley. I hadn't stepped inside yet. Something about it felt wrong. I had dreamed of this moment for decades, but now that it was happening, I had no idea what to do. What was I supposed to say? Where the hell have you been? Why did you leave me? Do you even remember me? I felt like I was 8 years old again. A nurse walked past, glancing at me. Are you family? The word hit me like a punch to the gut.
Family.
Did we even count as family anymore? I swallowed hard and nodded.
Yeah.
I am. She gave me a sympathetic smile. He's stable for now. You can go in. My legs felt heavy as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room smelled like antiseptic and stale air. The machines hummed softly, filling the silence. I moved closer to the bed, studying his face. Up close, he looked even worse, skin stretched thin, dark circles under his eyes, deep wrinkles carved into his forehead. His right hand rested limply on the blanket, the one missing a finger. I stared at it for a long moment, my breath caught in my throat. It really was him. A low groan broke the silence. His fingers twitched. His eyelids fluttered. Then, slowly, painfully, he opened his eyes. For a moment, he just stared at the ceiling, disoriented. Then his gaze shifted and landed on me. I stiffened. His eyes were clouded with confusion, but there was something else there too. Something familiar. Recognition. He blinked, his throat working as he tried to speak. Water. His voice was barely more than a whisper. I grabbed the plastic cup from the bedside table and held it to his lips. He drank slowly, his bony fingers gripping my wrist weakly. As he finished, he coughed, a deep, rattling sound. I set the cup down and took a step back. Then, for the first time in 41 years, he spoke my name. Michael? It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Like he knew. I exhaled sharply, my jaw tightening. How the hell could he recognize me? I crossed my arms over my chest, fighting to keep my voice steady. You remember me. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. His gaze drifted over my face, taking in the lines, the age, the life I had lived without him. I saw something flicker in his expression.
Guilt.
Regret.
Pain.
And maybe, just maybe, relief. I swallowed the lump in my throat. 41 years, Dad. My voice was quieter than I intended. Do you have any idea how long that is? His lips pressed together, his face contorting with emotion. Michael, his voice cracked, and for a moment, he looked like he might cry. But I wasn't ready for tears. I wasn't ready for excuses. You left, I said, my tone sharp. You left me. You left Mom. And you never came back. Silence stretched between us. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. I know. That was it. Not I'm sorry. Not I had no choice. Just I know. I let out a bitter laugh. That's all you have to say? His eyes dropped to his lap. His hands trembled slightly. He looked ashamed. But shame didn't undo 4 decades of absence. Shame didn't explain why I had spent my childhood wondering if he was dead, if he had abandoned me, or if I had done something wrong. Shame didn't change the fact that he had been alive this whole time, on the streets, just miles away from where I lived. You don't get to just say, I know, and expect me to be okay with it. My voice was rising now, my emotions breaking through. You don't get to disappear for my entire life and then show up as some homeless guy in an alley and expect me to just... I stopped myself. He was watching me with red-rimmed eyes, his hands clenched in his lap. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to argue. And somehow that made it worse, because it meant he knew he had no defense. He had no excuse. And maybe that was the worst part of all. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor. Then, finally, he broke the silence. I never meant to hurt you, he said, his voice hoarse. I never wanted to leave you. I clenched my jaw. Then why did you? He hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, because I thought you'd be better off without me. The words hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He lifted his gaze to mine, and for the first time, I saw it, the weight of whatever had happened to him, whatever had driven him to vanish, whatever had turned Richard Spencer, the father I had idolized, into the broken man sitting in front of me. I took a step back, my hands shaking. This was too much. Too fast. Too raw. I need some air, I muttered, turning toward the door. Michael, but I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I just walked out of the room because facing him was more than I could handle. Not yet. Not after 41 years of silence. I didn't know how long I sat there. The hallway was quiet, except for the occasional beeping of heart monitors and the soft murmurs of nurses. I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees, hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles were white. I had just seen my father for the first time in 41 years. And instead of feeling relief or closure, or any of the emotions I had imagined I'd feel in this moment. I felt like I was drowning. Everything I thought I knew about him, about myself, had just shattered.
Why now?
Why after all this time? I had spent years convincing myself that I was over it, that he had died or run off, or maybe never really loved us at all. But none of that had prepared me for this. For him to be alive. For him to be this. A man so thin, so frail, that he barely looked like the father I had once adored. A man who had lived on the streets for decades while I built a life, completely unaware that he was still out there. The weight of it was suffocating. I ran a hand down my face, exhaling shakily. Then I heard footsteps. "Mike," a familiar voice called softly. I glanced up.
Eric.
He had a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand, which he wordlessly handed me before sitting down next to me. I took it, wrapping my hands around the warmth, though my fingers still felt ice cold. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then, finally, Eric sighed. "So, it's really him." I let out a dry, humorless chuckle.
Yeah.
"It's really him." Eric nodded slowly, taking a sip of his own coffee. "Hell of a thing." That was an understatement. I stared down at my cup. He told me he thought I'd be better off without him. My voice was rough, almost foreign to my own ears. "That's why he left." Eric was quiet for a moment. Then he tilted his head. "Do you believe him?" I let out a slow breath. "I don't know." And that was the truth. I didn't go back into the room for hours. I stayed in that hallway, sipping stale coffee, replaying every memory I had of him over and over in my head. When I finally walked back in, the room was dimly lit, the soft hum of machines filling the silence. Dad was awake. He was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, I saw the man I remembered. Not the homeless figure from the alley. Not the frail patient in the hospital bed. But the father I used to know, the one who had lifted me onto his shoulders so I could see the fireworks on the 4th of July, the one who had taught me how to ride a bike, the one who had kissed me on the forehead and told me he'd be back. He turned, his gaze landing on me. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't place. I pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. "You owe me the truth," I said, my voice steady. "All of it." He nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this. And then he finally started talking. "I didn't leave because I wanted to, Michael." His voice was hoarse, tired. "I left because I had to." I stiffened. "What does that mean?" He exhaled, looking down at his frail hands. "I got in trouble, son. The kind of trouble you don't walk away from." My stomach clenched.
Trouble.
I repeated. He nodded, his expression darkening. "I owed some dangerous people money. A lot of money. And when I couldn't pay, they started threatening your mother." "Threatening you?" I froze. That was the last thing I had expected to hear. "I thought I could handle it," he continued, his voice heavy with regret. "Tried to reason with them, tried to buy myself some time. But they weren't the kind of men you negotiate with." A bitter smile flickered across his face. "One night, they showed up at the house. I wasn't there, but I got a call, a warning. They told me if I didn't disappear, they'd make sure my family paid the price instead." The room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. I swallowed hard. "And you believed them?" He met my gaze, his eyes haunted. "They weren't bluffing, Michael. You were a kid. You don't know the kind of men they were." A sick feeling curled in my stomach. "So you ran," I said quietly. He nodded. "I left everything behind. I had no choice." I stared at him, my mind racing. Had my entire life, my entire childhood, been shaped by something I never even knew about? Had I spent years hating a man who had been trying to protect me? I shook my head. "Why didn't you ever come back?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Because I didn't want to lead them back to you. At first, I thought I'd just lay low for a while.
But then a year passed.
Then 2. Then 5. And by then, I was too far gone. His voice cracked. I was ashamed. I had nothing left. No money, no home. I was just another guy sleeping under a bridge. He let out a shaky breath. And I told myself you were better off thinking I was dead. The weight of his words settled over me like a stone. For years, I had built a version of him in my head. A selfish man. A coward.
But now?
Now I didn't know what to think. Silence stretched between us. I leaned forward, rubbing a hand over my face. Jesus, Dad. He looked at me, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite name. I know I can't undo the past, Michael, he said quietly. I don't expect you to forgive me. I let out a breath. I don't know if I can. He nodded, as if he understood. And maybe he did. Because how do you forgive someone for being gone for your entire life? How do you forgive someone for letting you grow up believing they didn't love you? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time in 41 years, I had the truth. And maybe that was a start. The silence between us felt heavier than the years we had lost. I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees, staring at the frail man before me. My father. I had spent 4 decades imagining what I would say to him if I ever saw him again. I had thought about screaming, cursing him out, demanding answers. But now that I had them, I just felt empty. His words still echoed in my head. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. I thought you were better off thinking I was dead. I had spent my whole life believing that he abandoned me, that he just walked away because he didn't care. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was more complicated, more painful, and I didn't know how to feel about it. I let out a long breath, rubbing a hand over my face. So, what now? He blinked, as if the question had caught him off guard. What do you mean? I gestured vaguely. What do I do with this, Dad? What do we do? His face fell. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought I'd see you again. I scoffed, shaking my head. Yeah, well, neither did I. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I studied him, the lines on his face, the scars on his hands, the way his shoulders hunched forward like he was carrying the weight of a lifetime of regret. He looked tired.
No, exhausted.
And for the first time, I realized that I wasn't just looking at the man who left me. I was looking at a man who had suffered. A man who had spent decades alone, homeless, fighting to survive. All because of one decision he made when he was younger. A decision that had destroyed both of us in different ways. You could have come back, I said finally, my voice raw. After all these years, you could have found me. His eyes darkened. I wanted to, he admitted. So many times. Then why didn't you? He swallowed hard. Because I was afraid. Because I thought you'd hate me. I exhaled sharply. Well, you weren't wrong. A flicker of pain crossed his face, but he nodded slowly. I don't blame you, he murmured. I stared at the floor, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? Forgive him? Walk away? Pretend like none of this ever happened? There was no easy answer. I don't know how to fix this, I admitted. I don't even know if I want to. He let out a shaky breath. I don't expect you to, Michael. I don't expect anything from you. I lifted my gaze, meeting his eyes. They were tired, haunted. But for the first time, I saw something else there too.
Hope.
I just wanted you to know the truth, he continued. That's all. I clenched my jaw. Do you regret it? I asked quietly. Leaving. His expression crumpled. Every single day. The honesty in his voice hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent my entire life hating him, resenting him, But what if I had been holding on to that anger for so long that I never stopped to consider the pain he had been living with, too? I didn't know if I could ever forgive him, but I also didn't know if I could walk away from him again.
Not now.
Not after everything. I let out a slow breath. Okay, I said finally. He frowned slightly. Okay. I nodded, leaning back in my chair. I don't know where this goes from here, I admitted. But if you want to try, then maybe we start with a conversation. His lips parted slightly, like he wasn't sure if he had heard me correctly. Then, for the first time since I had walked into that hospital room, he smiled. A small, hesitant, hopeful smile. I'd like that, he said softly. And, for the first time in 41 years, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we weren't completely lost. Maybe, after all this time, we could still find our way back.